All right, welcome back, everybody. Thanks again for joining us on another Tuesday evening for the Resilient Future series, Practical Solutions to Uncertain Times. So for those of you that are tuning in for the first time, I'm just going to go over a couple of logistics really quickly. So first off, I want to introduce Charles Williams, who's in the chat. He just said, good evening, everybody there. So Charles is going to be our support person in there tonight. So if you're having any technical issues, you can check in with Charles about that. We have had a handful of folks that have had issues with the audio or the video, and we've been finding that if you log out and then log back in again, it usually fixes that. So yeah, so if you're having any issues, just log in, log back out. You can also check out Charles in the chat there. And throughout tonight's talk, if myself or Andrew reference various different links or resources, Charles will be throwing some of those links in the chat for you to have a look at. So if you see any links being posted from Charles, then just know that, yeah, those might be things that we're referencing and it might be worth pulling up and checking in on. So this series was hosted actually in partnership with myself and the organization that Charles is with, Earth Activist Training. I'm Chris Gilmore. I run Chris Outdoors. Earth Activist Training does all kinds of amazing work. They were actually our guest speakers last week with Charles and Starhawk. And a lot of their work is around permaculture, sustainable land design, social permaculture, and yeah, having a positive influence on the world through permaculture principles. And Chris Outdoors is all about helping people reconnect with the land in powerful ways, build their relationship with the natural world, and develop self-reliance and preparedness skills to be able to adapt to changing times, which is very on point with this whole series. The whole reason that we put this together was because, we were really picking up on a lot of grief and concern and overwhelm that people had when they started thinking about all the challenges in the world right now. Whether we're looking at geopolitics or we're looking at climate change and the environment, or we're looking at social divide, or we're looking at the economy and supply chain issues. There's a lot of stuff to think about, and a lot of it's changing incredibly quickly. That's very real. So what we wanted to do is, take on some of these challenges and changes that are happening in the world, and do so in a positive and proactive way, and try and break it down into inspiring stories, as well as actionable steps that people can take to help them be more adaptable and resilient as our world changes. I have a real strong feeling that the next 10 to 20 years are going to look very different than the past 10 to 20 years. So this series is really about kind of showcasing practical ways that we can look at adapting and preparing when we don't really know what's around the next corner. And then, of course, approaching this from a positive perspective. So that's what the series is all about if you're new with us. Just a couple of logistics before we introduce tonight's speaker, which is Andrew McMartin from the Pine Project. And we're going to be talking about specifically how do we support youth in this changing world, in a changing economy, when I bring Andrew on. So this is session number 6 of the series. There's one last next week, and all of the replays I've been sending out in all of the emails. So if you go to any one of the emails that I'm sending out, there's 2 different emails that come. There's one with your unique join link that you used to get on tonight, and then there's an email sent from me, Chris Outdoors. The one coming from me, if you scroll to the bottom of it, it'll have all of the past replays for all the past sessions. So if you want to catch up, we've covered a really interesting range of topics. We started with Dr. Naman Naeem, and we discussed mental health and, how that feeds into resiliency. And then I talked about emergency preparedness that night. We got into permaculture with verb permaculture. We got into physical health and supporting our immune systems and our nervous systems with Yarrow Willard from Wild Rose College. We had Shannon Lee Simmons on, a financial advisor for one of them, and we talked about financial resilient finances. There's been a whole bunch. Starhawk and Charles on last week, so it's been a really, really fun lineup so far. Our very last session next week, I want to give a quick shout out to it, and then we'll kind of dive into tonight's call. But next session, I'm really excited about. So we have Caleb Musgrave joining us. If you're not familiar with Caleb, he's an absolutely wealth of knowledge. He's from Hiawatha First Nation. He's a mixed Anishinaabe and Scottish gentleman. And yeah, just an absolute wealth of knowledge. And my wife, Laura, who is also a wealth of knowledge, is going to be joining as well with Caleb next week. And we're going to be talking about food sustainability and small scale food growing. So basically the theme of it is modern homesteading. And we'll be diving into, how do you, when we have struggling supply chains, when we have the cost of food going way up, how do you start to both grow as well as forage and work with local food systems on a practical level, regardless of whether you live in an urban center or you live on a homestead out in the country. So it's going to be packed full of practical advice. And we're going to dive into both foraging and growing and just sustainable food systems in general. So that's quite exciting. Hopefully you can join us next week with Caleb and Laura. So without further ado, we're going to dive into tonight's topic. And I've been starting each one of these sessions off with a little bit of gratitude, is one of the routines and tools we use to stay positive in times that can sometimes feel a little bit heavy. I really think of gratitude as a survival skill in and of itself. So as I'm sharing my gratitude, I'd invite you to share in the chat right now. What are you feeling grateful for today? I would love to hear in the chat, what are you feeling grateful for today and in this moment to kick us off and hear some collective voices there. So my gratitude tonight is for an incredibly special experience I got to witness last night. So there's an organization called the Oak Ridges Moraine Land Trust. And for those of you that aren't from Ontario, the Oak Ridges Moraine is a very significant watershed where a lot of springs come up through the ground, and then it basically becomes the water that feed into our major urban centers here in Ontario. Super, super important area. And, as I say that, I want to just share my gratitude for the water and for that land. And there's this organization called the Oak Ridges Moraine Land Trust that has been trying to get pieces of that property and put under land trust and protected long term, so we can preserve the forest there, the farmland, and keep those waters clean and recognize them as sacred. So I'm super thankful for that. But what was really special last night, and this is what I really wanted to highlight, is they hosted a webinar. I think it was actually a couple of weeks ago. My wife and I were watching the replay, and they brought on some people from the Williams Treaty Territory. That's what I live in here in Ontario. So they brought on some amazing knowledge holders and keepers, Anishinaabe folk from an organization called Creator's Garden. And I'm going to ask that Charles, can you share the link to both Creator's Garden as well as the Oak Ridges Moraine Land Trust? That would be much appreciated. So what really touched me about last night's presentation, so the presentation was actually on Anishinaabe-Moan bird names and the stories behind the meaning of them. Anishinaabe-Moan being the language spoken by the Anishinaabe or Anishinaabe people of this region. And I thought it was so cool and such an example of reconciliation in action. To see this organization that manages a large chunk of land starting to build real relationships with the Anishinaabe people of this land and starting to share in dialogue. So I'm super thankful to see the reconciliation work happening. I know there's so much work to be done still, but I'm just grateful that there's progress being made, and to see relationships like that, particularly when it comes to land management, makes me so, very thankful for that. And then I'm also feel so much grateful for the team from Creator's Garden that came on last night to actually share these amazing teachings. They were sharing the names of the birds at Anishinaabe-Moan, but then they were breaking down just how much wisdom is actually built into the Anishinaabe language in and of itself. And that it comes from just generations upon generations, literally thousands of years of deep relationship with the land is built into their language. So I'm thankful for the reconciliation acts happening really around North America, Turtle Island right now. I'm thankful for cross-cultural sharing and the people that are willing to share about their culture and their teachings. Super thankful to have had the privilege to sit in on that. And I'm thankful for knowledge holders around the world that are connected to these, I'm a geek for modern Western science, but I'm super thankful for the people that are connected to the old sciences, the cultures around the world that have been in relationship with the land for thousands of years, and the people that preserve that old knowledge. Just super thankful for that. So that's all the Indigenous people of Turtle Island, but also the people that hold that role around the globe. So those are my gratitudes for tonight. And so nice to hear your gratitudes as well. So I'm going to invite Andrew on right now. He's our guest tonight. So Andrew, if you want to come on stage here and join us. Oh, nice. Susan just said, love Joe's presentation. You must have been on as well. Chantel, do you remember a new word to share? I'd be worried about butchering it, but they were talking about owls. And there's a whole story, and it's not mine to share, but kokoko or okoko, I think it was, and they were referencing the barred owl and then the nation of owls in general. So there's my best take, and my apologies if I butchered the pronunciation a little bit. Before we kick things off tonight, though, Andrew, what are you feeling thankful for tonight?
Yeah, just super grateful for a nice weekend with family. I would just say like connections to family and friends. Had a wonderful. I have a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old, and we managed to sit down with my parents and have a dinner all together with them at the table, just participating and not killing each other, fighting, and sitting with my parents who really appreciated that. So really grateful for those moments. And I'm about to head out on some travel to reconnect with some old friends tomorrow. So just feeling very appreciative and grateful for relationships, family, and friends.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for joining us, Andrew. Yeah, so I've known Andrew for quite some time now, and I have a real, strong place in my heart for the organization that he's representing here tonight, the Pine Project, based out of Toronto. I've been involved with them, not so much in the last kind of 4 or 5 years, but was quite heavily involved with them a long time ago. And yeah, we're going to be chatting a little bit about how the Pine Project works with youth to build, core capacities that help them be resilient, help them be adaptable, and help them face some of these challenges that the world is addressing right now. So maybe a good starting point tonight, Andrew, would be just to tell us a little bit about how the heck did Pine come to be in the first place? What was your motivation for starting it, and what is the kind of the philosophy that it stands on? Why is it different in doing such important work?
Yeah, well, so it's interesting, and I think some of the topics that I hope to hit on tonight have a lot to do with this, because when I think about how Pine, or how movements or organizations, how things get started, it usually starts with a person, and in many ways, a very, very common theme these days, I find, especially with youth, but just across like modern Western civilization, is like the all about me, individualistic theme. So I'm going to start just talking about me. It's all about me here, and my story. I grew up in Toronto. I had quite a privileged or relatively privileged upbringing. As a white male with a lot of dominant identities, I had a lot of access. To different opportunities, and as a teen, I didn't go to camp as a kid necessarily, or connect with nature. I think the way many of the young kids that we work with do now, but in my mid to late teens, I really got an opportunity to get out of the city a bit more and experience some adventures in the wild, and got hooked on it in a lot of ways. Ended up working at some camps and outdoor organizations, which is part of how I know Chris. The thing that really struck me, I guess, or my experience with falling in love with the outdoors, and then moving on to teaching others about the outdoors, was this moment right in and around my 20s, sort of 21 age, when I was introduced to a very different way of knowing the land. I had an amazing experience. I was co-guiding a canoe trip, and the co-guide was a very patient, amazing mentor who just kind of noticed that I was really excited about some of the things that he was teaching, and he passed me a book at a kind of the perfect moment. And I went and leaned up against a red pine tree in Algonquin Park. And I remember it vividly, just one of those moments where sort of the whole world shifts around, or whole world shifted around me. And, I sat down to read the story and got up, holding some pretty different beliefs and some big questions. And the book led me to really just question what I was doing, and in many ways, like what I said I loved, I realized that I didn't really know much about at all, and that was a profound learning opportunity for me, and it led me down to the U.S. to a number of schools down there that teach all sorts of different wilderness survival skills, older ways of connecting to the land, some indigenous ways of knowing, and in my experiences, sort of seeking something that I believed in. It's like I really, as a early 20s individual, was looking for something to believe in. I struggled a lot finding that at school or in university, things like that. And I found a lot of that in many of these schools and many of the teachings that I got to learn. And then once I started practicing some of that myself, like coming back to Toronto, like to my home where I grew up, and going into my backyard and realizing I didn't know anything about the place that I called home was very eye-opening, and it really inspired me to start to get to know some of the other living things that were there. And after that, some of the living things that were in and around Toronto. And then wherever I went, I had field guides hanging out my backpack, and was just really seeking other people and mentors, whether the mentors were in a field guide or people that I could hang out with to start my real education. I had a degree in biology at that point, and I didn't know anything about my own backyard. So I think that just kind of goes to show you, my experience anyways, with the modern education system. And, it worked for me in certain ways and didn't in many others. So this is just a sort of a long-winded way of coming around to first just appreciating the acknowledgement that Chris shared to begin with, because, a lot of what I'm about to share about Pine is also in recognition of the indigenous lineages that have impacted my life so much, and this organization as well. And we've been on just a real journey over the last sort of 4 or 5 years in particular. The organization's been running for about 15 years, but really looking at over the last 4 or 5 years how we can more appropriately appreciate the indigenous lineage of many of the ways of engaging with the landscape that we use and we teach kids, rather than appropriating specific cultural practices. And so just it's very important for me, I guess, just to continue that that process by also recognizing, right now that there's actually a bit of writing that a woman in sort of our extended network shared recently that I really appreciated. And she was sharing the theory, her opinion that the way that Pine and many organizations like it engages with the out of doors is very much an indigenous way of being, and that many positive relationships with the landscape are indigenous. And that doesn't just mean indigenous Native North American, means indigenous cultures still living with a strong connection to their culture and their history all around the world. And she positioned that against more of a modern Western approach, which is much more sort of divide and conquer or dominate, and looking at the world around us as resources to be taken. And so I really appreciate that that lineage, and we work really hard in the organization, especially over the last bunch of years, to to teach, I guess, more different or more different histories than what I learned in school, and also bring in teachings from indigenous cultures all over the world. My own lineage is one that I've started looking into, and realizing that one of the ways that I first got excited about all of this was learning to make fire by friction, and rubbing sticks together to create a fire, out of nothing, which to me was just completely magical. And realizing recently that the tool that I use, the bow drill, has one of its origin stories is in my own lineage, from the Celts. And so just going through this practice and integrating a practice of really looking into our own histories is something that that has been quite transformational for us. So with all that said, the Pine Project. The Pine Project is an organization. I got going with Pine. I started the organization after some of those experiences that I had, really just starting to realize that I didn't know anything about my own backyard. And, I was a person that walked through the world saying, I love nature. I love the wilderness. I love being outdoors. I teach others about being outdoors. And so getting the opportunity to look with new eyes and realize I was a baby in terms of my, my knowledge and connection and relationship to the land that I relied on for, every breath I take, every mouthful of food I eat, so on and so forth. Just really inspired me to learn and then integrate this learning with kids. And eventually, having grown up in Toronto, I knew that there was a huge need for this type of connection, this type of relationship, between people and the natural world, but especially kids. And so I just decided on a bit of a wing and a prayer that this is what I was going to do. This was mostly ignorance and naivety, and I was very lucky that I had people like Chris, especially in the early years, to help me out and kind of conspire to create some really dynamic programs. And Chris, I think, undersells his involvement in the first bunch of years. We basically created our the whole line of Pine summer camps together some 12 odd years ago. And our origin story of our overnight camps is in Chris and Laura's backyard. So so he had a lot to do with the organization that we are now. And I mean, just in terms of the nuts and bolts, we're a Toronto-based charity. We work with over 2,000 kids a year. We spend 275 days a year out in the parks in Toronto and beyond. So we still operate overnight camps up in the Muskokas, and we run an amazing adult program, which sometimes is in the city and sometimes is out of the city. And really the whole idea behind Pine was it wasn't mine. It was things that similar kids programs that I witnessed and got to see and take part of a little bit down at some of these really inspiring organizations in the US where I learned. They had kids programs there, and I just started paying attention to what was happening, and it's just like blown away as an educator myself and someone that had always worked with kids. I just saw this really different way of engaging, and the content was so focused on building a very diverse, very deep relationship with the natural world around us, and not so much on adventure and leadership and going as far as you can through nature. It was really all about getting to know what was directly underfoot. And in many ways, what I saw was just like this hopeful vision for my experiences in sort of environmentalism and just wanting to see change. What I really appreciated about some of these programs was getting to experience the change I was actually seeking. And I just thought, wow, that's something that, like, if kids could grow up knowing that feeling, knowing that connectedness to each other, just to the world around them, to their own backyard, to the parks in the city where they call home, that seems really meaningful to me. So I mean, that's kind of the origin story of Pine, and how we do things is pretty different, I would say. And I often ask people just to think about one of the strongest relationships that you have that isn't biological. So not a child, not a parent. So someone you built a relationship with and didn't just start off loving, because there's also a biological attachment there. So think of that person, or one or two people that you just have such a strong connection to, and then start to think of like, well, how did that happen? How'd you get there with that person? And usually, when we take the time to really pick that apart and tell stories and, talk to each other about, these people and what they mean to us and how we got there, there's, a combination of emotional experiences, intellectual experiences, physical experiences, and, sometimes spiritual experiences, whatever that means for people. And each of those can look really, really different. Usually they're not just good. Usually there's volatility. There's ups and downs, and that's what really makes some of the strongest relationships are the ones where we've gotten through some real stuff together, like just the challenging stuff together. And as I think about like those types of experiences with other people, now all of a sudden it's a little easier for me to think about, okay, well, how could I apply those types of experiences to building a relationship with the outdoors, with nature? And in many ways, nature it takes care of us. Like I said, it's every breath we take, every bite we eat. So it just seems like good design from a permaculture sense. It seems like good design to have a strong relationship with the thing that allows us to keep living. And so how we get there, really, what I've always looked at is like, oh, well, how do I get there with another person? How can I overlay that into, my building, like my relationship journey with the outdoors? And we design our programs around that type of approach with Pine. So there's a lot of sensory experiences. There's a lot of like holistic type of experiences. We're not just walking around like with a field guide naming this, that, and the other. That's a part of it. It is important to like know who we're talking to and who we're talking about, but also knowing how these plants smell when we crush them up and make medicine out of them or make food out of them. How the wood smells as we carve it to make tools, or we burn it to keep warm in the winter. Like these are the types of experiences that give us a really deep relationship. And so I would say that's what our programs are designed around. And they're also, there's a lot of culture overlaid as well. And so like when I say culture, I just mean story. I mean songs. I mean, gratitude, like what Chris started with. Just practices that are connective, practices that are human. We don't take other people's stories unless we have permission, and we're encouraged to use those stories. But we take the principles and say, well, this actually showed up as I do more research. This showed up strongly in my culture, and then I can speak to it from that sense. But but just taking time to be together around a fire and tell stories, to sing songs together and feel that, even especially from a very young age, feel what it's like to tune in with a bunch of other folks singing a song. Because I didn't grow up identifying as a singer. It's like that's not a thing for me. Singing's quite uncomfortable for me, and it's only gotten more and more comfortable as I've had to practice with kids, and now I have my own kids, so I do a lot of it, which doesn't mean I'm great at it, but it feels good anyway. So yeah, that probably gives you the intro to me, and how that kind of flowed into the birth of Pine, and who Pine is and what it does. So yeah, there you go, Chris.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Andrew. That was a great intro. I guess there's two places I'd love to go with the conversation. I want to actually chat about, some of the tools that you actually work with youth. So we can leave folks that are looking for ideas of engaging with youth, whether it's their kids, whether they're mentoring cousins, whether they actually work as educators. But I think it'd be good to back up and kind of look at some of the challenges that youth are facing and just kind of name them, and then kind of try and create a bridge between the challenges. What's the philosophy around how do we prepare them when we don't actually really know what's around the next corner? And then what do some of those tools look at? Before I ask the next question, though, I got to throw one from the chat. Everyone, you're leaving everybody hanging. You mentioned this book. Can you explain what the book is?
So the book that I was handed was it was a book by a guy by the name of Tom Brown Jr., who is a a polarizing figure, which that's kind of our culture these days too, polarization, and different opinions. But Tom wrote a book. It's called, he called it A Field Guide to Wild Edible and Medicinal Plants. And the way he teaches is through stories. Tom is a white guy that grew up in southern New Jersey who was mentored from a very young age by a Lipan Apache elder. And so before the idea of cultural appropriation, before anyone knew what that was, Tom was being taught a whole lot of amazing cultural knowledge by this elder. And the vision that the elder was, his vision that he was working on was to pass this information on to Tom, who was then to teach others. I spent a bunch of time down there in New Jersey, what's called the Tracker School, with Tom. And yeah, he's an amazing human being. And I don't agree with everything that he does and says, but my life is dramatically different. And the work I'm able to do in the world is so much more powerful because of him. So I'm eternally grateful for Tom. And I've gone on a very different learning journey since I've been down there. The story was about his first hunt. So go figure, a book on plants starting with a story about a close range hunt. And it was just how he learned, not to ruin the story, but how he learned how interconnected things are, and he was to everything else. So that was one of the places that I got really inspired, and it worked for me. Again, I'll just leave it there. But Chris's question.
Let's chat about. I was going to say, let's first chat about, something that I've been thinking a lot about is just the rate of change. Even we think about our education system, even though it is changing, it's like it moves really, really slow. And when I think about everything from like AI, like how quickly social media has caught on, like, when I was a kid, we didn't have cell phones. Like I didn't get my first cell phone until I was literally in my 20s. And now, you see 6-year-olds with them. So I feel like, from the last 10 years, we've seen this exponential change, and we're going to see exponential change in the next 10 years. As somebody that works with youth every day and talks to parents every day, what are some of the main concerns and challenges that you're, seeing come up for both parents and youth? Let's maybe just name some of those, and then we can kind of go into, okay, now how do we actually start working with those and almost reverse engineering them to help them connect with nature and be able to prepare for a world where we really have no idea what the job force is going to look like. We don't know what it's going to look like 10 years from now, the world, with technology, jobs, a lot of things. So,
yeah, well, with AI, we don't know what next year is going to look like. Chat room, help us out here. What are you seeing? For those of you that are parents, teachers, folks that work with kids, what are the challenges? What's fresh? I'd love to see what just pops up here. And I would say, so big picture, screen time is a thing, and as a kid, I watched tons of TV, I played video games, but even though I watched tons of TV and played video games, I was only on screens, a couple hours a day. Whereas kids, I go into universities and give talks, and I ask them how many hours a day are you on, because they're all sitting there in a lecture looking at their laptops, supposedly listening to whoever's lecturing. And I just ask, well, how many hours a day do you look at that thing? Not one of them says less than 10. That's different than my childhood, which my childhood was pretty different than my parents and my grandparents. And I think, I like to look at it more, not from like a good or bad sense, but like, what's the consequence? Like, what's the action? What's the consequence? I think for 20 plus 30, like 25 plus years, we've been sort of talking in North America about like sort of a physical health epidemic, like kids childhood obesity, the rise of diabetes, like just generally kids not being able to physically do, most kids, many kids, like a much higher percentage of kids than ever in the past, not being able to do what kids in the past, was like average amount of physical activity. And so I think it started there in many ways, or like that's one of the things that I really noticed from the get-go. But then over the course of the last 10 or 15 years, I mean, it is dramatic, the difference in what I can expect an 18-year-old staff member to be able to do, 10 or 12 years ago versus today. And it's a bit scary. We've had to completely change our hiring, our expectations of our staff, how we supervise, how many staff we need to have, how much we need to tell people, what to do. I mean, for the most part, our approach really is one and has been one where we give people freedom. We give people sort of a container to work within, and there's a lot of freedom to make mistakes. And then the key is that you learn from them. There's always good questions and debriefing afterwards. And more and more these days, we don't have the luxury to be able to do that because many of our young staff cannot tell what a big risk is versus a little risk. And I think it's because they've never actually thought about it. They've never actually tried doing many of the things that they're doing with kids. So they've never gotten to fail, learned the experiences that life teaches, and got to build common sense. I think for generations, people have been saying like common sense, too bad common sense isn't so common anymore. But I think generation over generation, it's just getting less and less, because my experience is common sense comes from life experience, tons and tons of life experience. And, from the days of hearing about like what my parents' childhood was like, or my grandparents' childhood was like, and seeing the scientific evidence of the range that they used to travel, the distance from home as a 6-year-old or 8-year-old or a 10-year-old that they traveled, 100 years ago. It was like, as a 5 or 6-year-old, people, like kids, would regularly be traveling like 10 to 12 kilometers from home, on the daily. The next generation was like 6. The next generation was like 1. Our generation, the kids like today, is like 30 yards type of thing. Like, it's just, so the experiences are less. And so obviously there's just less to draw on, in terms of making sound judgments in the world, navigating, the ups and downs of life. And a lot of what I see, and a lot of our work with the young kids is creating an opportunity for the kids to get, be given to us from the parents. And like, some parents are doing tremendous jobs, letting their kids like fall over and get up on their own, not picking them up and dusting them off, letting them learn how to do that themselves. Other parents, like the culture really is like, if you're doing that as a parent, it's hard to get by and not get some critique from this person, that person, as you walk through the world. So a lot of parents, arrive. I remember times working with kids, like van would pull up, kid would get out, or the parent would unbuckle. This is like a 10-year-old parent would unbuckle their seatbelt. They'd get out, they'd stand there as the parent dressed them. And I'd just be watching, and it's like, okay, this one's going to take some work. And then we would go on an adventure, and some of the kids, not that particular kid, but I remember some of the kids, like, we'd go on a walk, and the parent would be like, here's the rain jacket. He's like, he won't put it on. Can you make him wear it? And I'd be like, yeah, sure. I'll just, on top of my backpack, is just with us. Yeah, it was raining 8 degrees, 9 degrees the whole day. And I was just watching him, making sure that he's okay. And by the end of the program, it's like a 2 or 3 hour program. So he was never really in any real danger. He wasn't getting hypothermic. He was fine, running around, warm, all the rest, and we're walking back, and everybody's like dressed head to toe in rain gear. This kid's got his like overalls on, but no jacket on. And his lips are blue. He just turns to the rest of the group. He's like, hey, is anyone else freezing? I just looked at him. I was like, look at how everyone else is dressed. He's like, oh yeah, okay. And he just wore his rain jacket from then on. Like, it's just, it's just one of those things. Like, if we give them the chance to experience discomfort, they learn from it, because discomfort sucks. And kids are really resilient if we give them the chance, but very often we're just trying to make their lives as easy and as good as possible, especially as parents, because like, God, I love my kids so much. I just don't want them to feel anything bad. But that's a very short-term approach, because if I don't ever let them feel anything bad, they grow up and they're next to useless. They've never had to overcome a problem in their life. And so they have no muscle built around problem solving. So I mean, this, and I see the one question, do you correlate adults taking less risk? I think it's cumulative. So kids, like every generation, take less risks, grow up into adults who are less comfortable with risks. And that passes on to an exponent, to the next generation. So I think there's work that we can do to like shift this. But I mean, like big picture, I mean, we're in a mental health epidemic that's like been recognized across the world. Not just because of COVID, but COVID sure didn't help. Physical health is challenged, especially in the Western world. I don't see a ton of accountability. I don't see a lot of like understanding of natural consequences, not a lot of problem solving. Resilience is low, like lower and lower, across the last like 10 or 12 years. And it just kind of goes on from there to like these sort of, I would say like big picture, like core competencies, character traits type of thing. There's just less experience with the real world, and so those aren't as developed. And I look at them all like it's like going to the gym. If you go to the gym, you work out your muscles, they get stronger. If you go into the outdoors, or you get wherever the forum is that like teaches you whatever like the challenge is, you get to work on that, and that's an opportunity as much as it's a difficulty to problem solve around and overcome. But I think also important to recognize, like, we have like climate emergency, like the politics and everything is so incredibly polarized and opinionated. Like the amount of screen time kids experience, like just the unknowns around the future. Like we're landing that on kids younger and younger and younger. They don't, like, I see kids not really able to have a carefree childhood anymore because there's so much access to information. And adults are putting this on kids younger and younger as though it's like their problem to solve. And I mean, no wonder anxiety's through the roof. Like these things they're terrifying for me, let alone like a 5 or 6 year old. I just don't think it's appropriate for that age. Like they'll get to the age when, they need to know about this stuff and they need to do something about it. But I think the key is like building relationship and love first, to each other and, and to the natural world. Anyways, Chris was talking about like backing up and talking about the problems. That's a lot of the problems I'm seeing on a day-to-day basis. And I see a lot of them in the chat too.
Yeah, there definitely seemed to be this theme around risk and hesitancy to that, and I'll just share really quickly, my background, similar to Andrew, I worked in the wilderness guiding world and have a very similar story, being exposed to Tom Brown Jr. and then getting to meet, just going down a rabbit hole of like, wow, I have no idea, like this whole language of nature was around me. I don't know my own backyard and I'm 21-year-old canoe guide. But where I was going with that is, canoe guiding, we take kids out at a fairly young age, like probably some of the youngest kids I were taking out, 10, 12 years old. And we're going out into the wilderness. And I was doing this before there was cell phone service in the backcountry. We often did not have satellite phones. And occasionally when we did, they often didn't work anyways. And we would I used to do fly-in canoe trips where we'd literally get flown by float plane, dropped off in the middle of nowhere, and you're completely on your own for 10 days with these kids, like young kids. And sometimes it would get really, really hard. And there was no going home to a comfortable space. There was no, there was no going home to a comfortable place. You were in it, you were a team. And what I saw in that was that kids learned that they were capable of so much more than they realized they were, because they had no choice to but pull through, you're soaking wet and you're tired and you're hungry, but you're not actually at camp. You're in a canoe in the middle of a lake and it's raining and you've got 2 hours more to paddle. So it doesn't matter that you're hungry. It doesn't matter that you're cold. you've got 2 hours before food exists. So you can either complain about it and shut down, or you can paddle harder for 2 hours. And then when you get there, you get celebrated by this meal, and I just saw kids grow so much in those experiences. And there is risk in that, there is the possibility that somebody could get hurt. But there's something I think a lot about is, what is the risk of kids not having that healthy relationship with risk? If kids aren't exposed to the risk or taught what they're truly capable of, and then they become an adult, they could get themselves in a lot of trouble. So how do we navigate that risk now? And what's the consequence of it is a really, really great question. Andrew, you mentioned this term core competencies, and I know that's a major thing. So when we don't know what's around the next corner, and then the other thing that I think we're navigating here too is just knowing that we come from such a mix of cultures. We have people of all different values. It's really important in our work. We're not giving parenting advice. We're not trying to create a one size fit all, like A plus B plus C, take a kid on a canoe trip and expose them to this and they come out like that. It's not a formula like that, right? We're not preparing them for a specific outcome that we're training them for. You mentioned this term, like really we work with this idea of core competencies that allow them to follow their own passion in life and also be adaptable as the world changes. So do you want to kind of speak to what you mean by core competencies and then some of the tools that you actually use to start developing those?
Yeah, sure. So first I would just mention there's this amazing resource if you haven't seen it. Man by the name of Sir Ken Robinson, who I think is recently in the last few years passed away, unfortunately, but a brilliant thinker, has this amazing TED Talk on, I think the question is, do schools kill creativity? I remember watching this years ago and I loved what he was saying, even, 10 years ago, whenever it was that the video came out, he was just really questioning, like, do we know what the future holds? Especially like considering we rewrite the textbooks kids are learning from like year after year, like everything's changing, but we're still doing things the same way. And we're in, as Chris was saying, a time of such rapid change. We have no idea what jobs are going to look like. We have no idea what the world is going to look like in a few years. Why are we educating for like based upon specific content rather than looking at like big picture competencies or character traits, things like creativity and problem solving and adaptability and inquiry and curiosity and like grit and resilience, teamwork, positivity in the face of challenge. Like, I mean, you could just list all the things that you when you sit down to meditate in the morning, you're like, this is what I want for myself today. It's like all those things. And the amazing thing is we can actually educate for those things. If we design around it, again, back to this idea of like, how are we designing and is it working? Is it serving us? Is it serving our kids? And I just think more and more and I'm not the type of person that wants to throw out like the entire education system, just to be clear. Like, I think it's got a lot of things going for it. And I don't think it's holistic or balanced. It's a very specific way of doing things kind of over and over and over again. And it works for some kids, but I still think even those kids could get a real dose of like, holistic experiences and they would benefit from it. And I would just say like part of the reason why I chose what I chose, in terms of creating an organization that works with kids in the city, in the outdoors in the city. It's just that this is the forum that I saw the most character traits really develop in. It was, and I also want to just kind of like put my finger on something too, like some of like my stories, and I think like I speak a little bit for Chris here too. Our stories, because our background is similar, will be from a very specific like white male lens, as an example, but working with a bunch of different groups and schools and communities here in Toronto, I recognize, and I've learned a lot over the last like 5 or 10 years, about how like my experience is not similar to everyone's experience. Like, newsflash, Andrew. And yet, even though many people face like huge barriers to access, nature is still available, and all of these types of experiences are still available. And the question is like, how do we reduce barriers to access? How do we introduce different people in different ways to the same thing, you know, in a sense. And you know, and I think that's why like nature presents such an amazing opportunity or such an amazing forum for developing these things. I think in some ways, I really appreciated, I can't remember who said it or where I read it, but you know, once upon a time, 10 or more years ago, you know, read the idea like we're humans that have evolved over a long time, and we evolved most of that time in nature. So there's medicine there that is really good for us, you know, and we are designed to operate in that space. And no matter how amazing some of the like pace of change is and like the tech that we're creating, it has some pretty tremendous benefits and some pretty amazing opportunities, but it's moving faster than our evolutionary design can keep up with in some ways. And, you know, I know I feel that when I'm bombarded by, you know, news stories and tech and screens and all the rest, I get completely overwhelmed. So I go for a walk outside and it helps a lot, you know, and I think, you know, nature in many ways is like the pace of, like the way I function, you know, it's the pace of development and healthy human development. And so I think that's why that forum works in many ways, or it's like, that's my opinion anyways, and what I see. Yeah, so I think that answered your question, Chris, around like what the core competencies are, right?
Yeah. So if you, yeah, I mean, I wonder if you were to just actually literally like kind of list some of the things that you're kind of trying to develop or work with there when we think about core competencies, though. Like I think about things like creativity and problem solving.
Yeah. So no, I did earlier. I went through just like the creativity, like problem solving, adaptability, like curiosity is a big one, inquiry, and like being curious and being willing to ask good questions and answer them yourself without just turning to somebody else and be like, hey, what's this? That's a huge one. You know, I think I mentioned like grit and resilience, and I speak about this in terms of a very specific type of resilience, because resilience, different forms of resilience come through any challenging situation. And, you know, there's plenty of folks that we work with that don't need any more resilience in their lives in certain ways. But what the outdoor experience provides is a very different type. And it's, you know, the types of spaces we create are really quite safe. As I was, you know, I described that story of the kid with the blue lips. Like, he was never in any danger. He wasn't comfortable. And that allowed him as a learner to actually break through and become aware, like, oh, I actually have a choice to do something else here. And so a lot of the experiences we're designing are safe. And, you know, the idea is the worst possible thing that could happen is discomfort, and we're okay with that. And then, you know, the type of discomfort might be social at times. It might be environmental. It might be, you know, it might be given a problem and like not given an answer. You know, and a lot of times our staff, like, that's one thing kids aren't used to with our programs, because, you know, the staff will ask a question and they won't give the kids an answer. They're like, no, I believe you can figure this out. You know, and the amazing thing is, like, minutes or hours later, however long it takes for the specific problem to be solved, inevitably what happens is the kids all start brainstorming and they come up with different answers. And then there's this like beautiful opportunity to be like, oh, wow, so who's right? You know, which answer is right? They're all like, they're all right. Or like, this one works well, or we tried this and it worked, and we tried this and it worked, and this one worked for this person and this one worked for that person. I'm like, cool. So are we stronger or are we weaker with more answers to a problem? They're like, oh, yeah. It's like this whole like, wait a minute, the textbook didn't say that, you know. But it's an amazing opportunity for them to just look differently at each other and how they solve problems and how they work together, you know, and just difference in general. Like, there's a huge teaching there around it. So those are some of the ways that we're designing. You know, what I would like, in some ways, I've just been kind of turned on to this term of anti-fragility, and I hear one of the recent talks is, you know, all about anti-fragility, and I love it in terms of like the human experience, because humans are so anti-fragile in many ways. Like if we remove all volatility from the human experience, people just become not very inspiring. They become like, what's that movie, Wall-E, with all the, like, it's a cartoon where machines do everything for everyone, and the people just, like, they're big blobs, like very overweight blobs. They don't do anything, and they just float around on their machines because technology is doing everything for them. But as soon as you, like, introduce challenges, and especially if they're, like, relatively safe, but also, like, not very comfortable, kids just, like, people just have to, like, look, in some ways, just, like, look in the mirror and say, like, well, great. So this is uncomfortable. It's raining. I'm outside for the next 3 hours. What am I going to do about it? Like, is complaining actually making this better or worse? What can I do that actually makes my situation better? And I think that's a great example of, like, challenges and, volatility and, like, outside pressures, creating the opportunity for change and for inspiration and for creativity. And I see that over and over again. And I think nature's just, like, beautiful in that way. Like, there's a lot of design behind our programs, sometimes too much, in my opinion. But just going outside with kids, like, especially no matter the weather, go outside, like, a couple days a week, every week of the year, and nature is just teaching most of the important lessons, to you or your kids or whatever it is. And that's one of the things that we talk about we have a parent and taught program. So parents with kids between 0 and 4 years old. And we always just say, the most important thing you can do is get everybody dressed and show up. Just every week, just show up. It doesn't matter what the weather is, because the act of, like, getting everyone dressed and getting everybody prepared and actually getting there is, like, momentous. Everybody has those days with kids where it's just, like, the hardest thing in the world is just to, like, get the kids out the door. But it gets easier. Like, it just gets easier and easier and easier. And all of a sudden, going out in various weather is, like, something the kids just don't know anything different. And they're like, oh yeah, well, it's raining, so I just dress different and let's go play. And that's the beauty. But it takes years. Like, it takes months and months and months and years and years and years, for the kids to just realize, like, oh, well, or not even realize, to not know, to just have that deeply embedded as, like, yeah, we go outside and play. It's like, it's raining, it doesn't matter. And there's a bunch of kids I know that, they started as, like, 1-year-olds in these programs, and they're 6 or 8 or 10 or 12, or some are 20. And they're out there when the weather, like, they're the ones in the park that you're like, whoa, who is that? Why is that person outside right now? It's like, because they're in our programs. But they just don't see those challenges because they aren't challenges for them. That's the cool thing.
Awesome. There's a question in here that's actually kind of a great segue, because I'd love to kind of start chatting a little bit more of some of the specifics, and you've already named some in some of the stories you've been telling there. Given an example of the kid with the jacket, and there's this perceived sense of risk from his parents, that it's rainy and he's going to get cold, but he didn't actually care or notice it until the end of the day. You're obviously monitoring. Is this actually dangerous? No, it's not. If it's getting close, we can do something about it. And then it created this perfect lesson opportunity at the end of the day when he said, anyone else freezing? No, look at how everybody else is dressed, So that was just a great example. But someone in the chat just asked, do you work with teenagers who have had a little access or have had little access or exposure to nature? So let's chat about maybe some other kind of stories and tool sets that people can start working with. Because, one thing I was inspired by when I first was introduced by some of my mentors into this different way of building relationship with the land is this idea that, kids are capable of so much more. But there's also this reality of, like, if you weren't raised that way, if every generation we lose a little bit, we can't just immediately go back there. I think about it. I had the privilege of going on a canoe trip 2 years in a row with a Cree elder named Fred. He actually passed away a couple years ago, and he was still canoeing at 84 years old. Super, super inspiring. But I remember sitting around the campfire with Fred one evening and him telling me the story. In his community, they used to send people out when they're 16 years old out on the land by themselves for 4 days. And like, auntie or uncle would take them out on the land. And I apologize if I'm, getting little pieces of the story mixed up. It was a while ago when I sat with Fred, but the essence of the story is he said, we used to, someone turns 16, we bring them out on the land. This is way up in the Boreal Forest, way up in north. There's bears, there's wolves, you can get lost. And we leave them out there for 4 days. And what was really fascinating, that the question that came up, I'm like, well, were you guys like just around the corner? You were obviously watching them, right? Like, no, we actually went back to the village. Like, we actually left them. Nobody was watching them. Nobody checked in on them for 4 days at all. And I was like, how often do people get hurt or die? He's like, it doesn't really happen. So by the time they were 16, they could literally be left for 4 days out in bear country where they could get lost. They had that competency. So hearing stories like that has really inspired me to know what kids are actually capable of. But then there's also this reality that like most of the adults today couldn't do that. So we can't just do that now. I can't just take a kid and stick them out in the woods. We need to start to work on subtly redeveloping these competencies again. So I would love some of your thoughts on some of the tools that you folks are working with, Andrew, in doing that. And maybe as you think about that, I'm going to share one really cool story here about one that I really like that we've worked with. And then I'd love to hear some of the ones that are your favorites, Andrew, that people could work with. And how to create the safe container with the perceived risk and the lessons in it. But the story I want to actually share comes from one with an adult, but it's relevant because we do this with youth. And it was actually an Indigenous lady that was at one of our programs, and we did this thing called a drum stock, where we blindfolded all of the participants, and basically we take them way off into the woods. Like, I can't remember how far it was, but it was over half of a kilometer, and we blindfold them. They're all spread out. And then we go off into the distance with a drum and we start to slowly drum, and they literally have to walk blindfolded through the forest. So we're doing this activity as part of this program, and it's super edgy for some people. Anxiety comes up and all kinds of things come up for people. It really pushes some edges, but it's amazing, the development. So anyways, long story short, that evening we're sitting around the campfire debriefing it. And this one lady basically says, hey, I want to tell you a story about how this actually saved me one time. She's like, I did this as a kid. So I can't remember her Indigenous lineage, but she was like, I was actually taught this as a kid and we did this activity growing up. So I'm familiar with this. And one time I was way up in Manitoulin on this hike, and I'd hiked way up to this ridge to watch the end of the day. And I fell asleep on this rock. And she's like, I woke up and it was dark. And she's like, I was suddenly terrified. I'm in the middle of the forest and I have no flashlight and I don't know how to get back. Like, I'm lost. It's pitch black. I can't see a thing. And she's like, I started to panic. I started to worry. And all of a sudden in her mind, she remembered this drum stock she did as a kid. And she thought, oh, what did I do during the drum stock? Oh, I felt the earth and I let my feet guide me, not my eyes. So she actually took off her shoes and walked around until she could actually feel the difference of the hard packed track. And I think it took her a couple hours to walk down. She walked incredibly slowly, sometimes hand and knees and sometimes on her foot. But this blind drum stock actually allowed her to walk the trail in the dark all the way back out from the spot as an adult. And she was like almost like in tears, like telling the story, like how powerful of an experience it was with her. And how proud of her she was that, one, she was able to calm her emotions in that moment. To be in this really stressful and actually like really dangerous, like, she walks the wrong way, she can fall off the cliff, like she could actually die in that situation. But because she had this relationship with the earth and she'd done this like perceived risky activity as a kid that she was able to fall back on, she was now able to use this tool set to actually get out of this situation as an adult, and then felt super proud of herself for what she was able to accomplish in this scenario. What could have gone really bad was actually like a really empowering experience for her that she shares to this day. So anyways, I thought I'd just share that story and that example right there. And I'd love to hear some of the, what are you working with these days and liking for activities?
Yeah. I mean, first I would say, especially for the parents out there, like, be patient with yourself. We are working against the current. And so I'm not going to say like that what we do at Pine is like a magical formula that works for everyone. It doesn't. It works best when the parents are on the exact same page that we are, and they start the kids early, and And even then, many of the kids just grow up to be their own people, and they're like, nah, I'm not really that into this, which is fine. And what I would say is that the things that I have found to work well with people, and teens are their own enigma. They're really in a developmental life stage where they're trying to figure out who they are. I mean, it might not look like it all the time, but that's happening somewhere in there. And so there's a lot of opposition and like especially anti-home cultures. Like that's the things. Like, this is all I've ever known. How am I going to find out who I am if I'm in this? So they're just pushing against it. So that's normal if you're feeling that all the time. And if they're already addicted to video games, like that, the culture is powerful. Like, and it's I feel you in a lot of ways. So the tools that I always come back to, and I think like number one, remember I started, it's like, this is all about me. It's all about me. And what I'm going to say is, it is all about you. If you want your kids to do something, do it yourself. And I've seen this all the time, all the years with all the kids. If I am doing something, like, they might not do it right away, but if they're seeing it time and time and time and time and time again, and I'm consistent with it and I keep doing it, usually they start doing it. And as a parent, it's hard because usually this shows up like a decade later. You don't know, like it's like, oh crap, like I tried so hard and I failed to like connect my child with nature. And then, they're like 28 and they're coming back to it, type of thing. So I just, don't be hard on yourself, but like, if you want something for them, start doing it yourself. Integrate it into your life, wherever you can. And if you can find like connective moments to bring them into that in ways that are inspiring for them, then you're starting to like stack the deck in the right direction. If it becomes like you're doing this because this is what I said, it's not going to work, especially if they didn't grow up doing it. So the other like kind of magic like card that I think can be pulled out is look for someone who's really inspiring, who they would look up to, and who offers some of like what you want for them, and introduce them to that person. Don't try to teach them yourself. Find a mentor for them. Find somebody like, and I know easier said than done in a lot of ways. If we could all just pick our kids' friends, like, the world would be easier. But especially with younger kids, this is where, like, for me, I'll be enrolling my kids into programs. I'm like, well, I want them to learn this, this, and this. I'm actually not going to teach them, but I'm going to enroll them in this. When they come back inspired with the stories, then I'll pick up on that inspiration, and all of a sudden they want to do this stuff with me. So it's just kind of about paying attention to like what the relationship is, and just acknowledging like, I'm my kid's dad. That there's a role there. I can't be everything. I can't be cool. Like, that's something I'll never be to my kids. Like, they'll love me to death, hopefully, and take care of me when I'm older, and hopefully look back on like, oh yeah, all those things my dad did with me when I was a kid, like they really impacted me, it turns out, after I tried to kill my parents when I was a teenager, by doing terrible things. But the more I can put them with people that are inspiring them and teaching them great stuff that like I think serves them and is in alignment with my values, I think like everything gets easier for me. So that's a big one. And it's not just as easy as like finding those people. You got to do some hard work. You got to like, it's like trying to find a decent babysitter. It's like that can be hard.
Can I throw one in quick, Andrew?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, just to throw it. This is a really cool example that actually came from a friend the other day. But something I've thought a lot about, and we work a lot with at the Pine Project, at least when I was involved, the idea of really trying to tap in on what the kids' natural passions are. And often the first day of camp, we wouldn't actually plan a lot of structured activities. It was really about, doing a bunch of loose things, letting the kids run around and just watching them and trying to figure out, because if I try to teach kids tracking, like they probably don't care about tracking. They probably don't care about the names of plants, some of them probably do, but my experience is most of them don't. But if I can figure out what their natural passion is, running around, fighting, whatever it is there a way that I can now reverse engineer that and bring it towards these deeper relational pieces and these core competencies? So here's an example. My friend was telling me about, they try not to have much screen time at their house, but their son, whenever he goes to a friend, that's all they do. So he's like, he can't quite control it, because as soon as he leaves the house, he's with his friends. They're not going to deny him going out with his friends. He's playing screen time. So his friends become addicted to Minecraft. So he's budged a little bit. He's like, okay, we're going to let him play some Minecraft. But he's like, you know what? For his birthday this year, I'm going to buy him a Minecraft Lego game. Because now at least he's inspired by Minecraft already. Now at least I'm taking him one step away from the screen, at least once in a while, and we're going to play Minecraft Lego. So now at least he's like developing some dexterity with his hand. He's being creative with a thing. And then what he did is, after they started playing with the Lego, he was like, hey, you know what? I bet you we could build a Minecraft fort in our backyard, like out of real stuff. So now he took it away from the Lego, and now they're actually building a Minecraft castle out of real things in their backyard. And the whole essence of that is he was taking this kid's addiction to a video game and reverse engineering it to actually, now the kid's like literally learning how to use saws and nails and hammers in the backyard to build the video game structure, but in the real backyard. So I think there's really something to, like, instead of just being like, hey, I want you to learn about this, or I want to teach you this, or I want you to go to nature camp. It's like, what are they already passionate about? And what is the thread that can just slowly, expose them to these other things? Yeah, I thought I'd plant that seed.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I was going to bring up is just this whole role modeling point, like do it for yourself. But not just doing it for yourself. And I think that's critical, is going on your own nature connection journey, and finding your own passions and learning in front of the kids and learning as an older person. Like, those are very important lessons that will find their way deep into their psyche. And it's just important for kids to see people like continuous learning, that if you think something's important, live that. But as an example of one of Chris's points, I would always, I always try to talk to my staff about like paying attention to, what the kids' passions are, exactly like what Chris was saying, but also like developmentally, like where are they at? Like what, not to like stereotype, but sometimes just like what's a stereotype? Like if you were just to like take this group of kids and like throw them in the outdoors together and walk away and somehow like have a drone like watching what they're doing, like what would they naturally do? And I think you can kind of bookmark the ages in some ways, like, sort of 3, 4 to like 6, 7. There's like just imagination. They're not living in the real world. They're living in this like amazing creative place. It's like half the real world and half just like whatever they're making up, which is so amazing. And then like 8 to 10, 11-year-olds, they're just moving. I mean, a lot of them are moving a lot. And so I'm painting some broad strokes. This is not true of everyone. So we really pay close attention to like who fits into this, who really doesn't fit into this. How can we design for each? But like, I'm trying to make a point eventually here. And as an example, I used to work with 10 to 13-year-old boys after school program. And those kids, like, talk about like stereotype, like lazy, don't want to do anything. They just kind of show them like whatever. So I would just be working on some sort of like really dangerous weapon, making one. As they arrived, I'd just be making this like terrifyingly dangerous weapon that all of them be like, what's that? I'd be like, put it away. Be like, what? They'd be like, Joe, what is that? Can I see it? Like, no, you can't see that. Like, I have to be able to trust you. What have you done that would build trust between us? Like, how have you shown me that you're responsible? And they're like, they just had nothing. I was like, great. What does responsibility look like? Because I'll let you see that, but you got to show me you're responsible. Let's look at the journey from here to you getting to see that. and paint that out. And they'd all just be like, cool, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to become responsible. I want to see the sharp, dangerous thing, and that was just like, that's like a gross generalization, but that's a true story. I would do that with those kids because I knew it worked. And I would just challenge them in that way. And so it's just like kind of about paying attention to like what's inspiring and like trying different things and just paying attention to like what gets them, like not what am I interested in, what gets them, and how can I take that on a journey? Like with littler kids acting poorly, the question I always ask is like, oh, do you like superheroes? Like, who's your favorite superhero? Does that superhero treat people like that? And it's just like a way to, like, as soon as you can find a connection with like someone they look up to, all of a sudden you can start looking at like, well, okay, but how do they do things? How would this show up for them? And that becomes a conversation that they're actually kind of interested in and that they know something about. And it just tends to land a little bit more than, me being like, oh, don't do that. That's not nice, that type of thing. But to get into tools, so there's the like, find other mentors who teach, sort of similar things. I would say like communities of practice. So like if you want to do this for yourself and go on a nature connection journey, which I cannot recommend enough, it is transformational and life-changing. And like I said, it's just good design. I highly, highly recommend it. And that can look like a lot of things, but I would just say start. And the beauty of nature is everything's connected. So if you start going down a path, it's just going to connect you to everything, which is great. Again, good design. But if you do it by yourself, it will just go slow. If you can find other people that can challenge you and challenge your assumptions and ask you hard questions, peer mentor each other, inspire you when you're not feeling inspired, and vice versa, then the learning curve just starts to like totally go parabolic, which is awesome and a very good feeling and inspiring in and of itself. So just finding other people that are interested in these things and community of practice. I would say being curious, practice curiosity. And this is like a very difficult thing to do because I would say anyone that has spent a lot of time in the modern education system has been deeply taught that answers are the thing. And I think answers are great, but they're not the only thing. And it's not a balanced experience if we're just focused on answers, because there's so much potency in questions and in the process and journey of answering a question for oneself. Because Chris and I might be asked the same question and we might go out and like really think about it and figure it out. And we might come up with totally different answers to like the question that are both right and each work for us. And then, like I said before, are we stronger or weaker with two different answers to the same question? It's just like, it's great. It's just how, culture and evolution and, science and all the things that we have now. It's like, that's how they happen. It's like people being creative and coming up with their own solutions to problems. But going on a journey of learning with the kids, so you can ask kids lots of questions, and especially if they're genuine and you're interested, you find a few field guides and they find something like, oh, cool. Wow. What's going on? As an example, my daughter and I, our whole family, but mostly my daughter and my wife and I found caterpillars last year, the monarch caterpillars, and we raised like 35 of them. It was something ridiculous like that. We caught all these caterpillars and raised them in these little homes. And, as we did it, like my daughter was only 4, and so I just like ask her these questions. She'd look at it. She'd be like, oh, that's so cool. I'd be like, oh, what colors do you see? Where do you think the eyes are? What's it doing right now? Just like asking questions and letting her answer and not worrying at all whether I agreed with her answer. Just like asking questions and letting her answer and build confidence. And then like in different ages and stages, asking sort of more appropriate age and stage questions and just being curious. And sometimes letting the answer go, like if it's not right. Sometimes, and at a certain point or certain age and stage, just be like, oh, cool. Like, why do you think that? Can you prove it? And kind of challenging them on like, oh, you just made up that answer. That's awesome and very creative. Prove it to me. I don't believe you. And at like 8 or 9 years old, that's just like a hilarious conversation to have with a kid. And if you're looking things up with them and you're going and finding these mysteries, because like nature is full of them, and you're figuring out how to use the field guide, and you're teaching them how to use the field guide by you figuring it out with them, then all of a sudden they're learning. They don't necessarily feel like you're teaching them because you're obviously learning right there with them. It's much less like teacher student type of, parent child type of activity. It feels so much more peer based, which is very inspiring for a lot of kids. So just like the value of curiosity and going on these learning journeys, asking lots of questions, and you can do it with like risk assessment. You can do it with discipline. You can do it with birds and nature and whatever. Like, with my daughter, we'd go on walks when she was really, really little, when we lived in the city. And right now, especially, and for the next month, month and a half, like just the flowers are just like new flowers every day. And so we just cruise along and be like, oh, wow. I wonder what that one smells like. And we just go and smell every single flower and just engaging with the senses in that way. We'd see flowers from far away and be like, oh, I wonder what that one smells like. Let's go check it out. We'd go and we'd get pollen all over our noses, and then became like, we'd paint each other's faces. It's just so fun, very sensory interactive. Like we're building these relationships with not just the plants, but also how we interact with the outdoors, like, and how we walk down the street. We're just way slower than everyone else. We're paying attention with our noses. We're paying attention with our eyes, and then eventually, like on other walks, I'd hear birds and be like, oh, what do you think that is? They're just sponges. She just soaked it up. All of a sudden she knew all the birds on the street. She's forgotten most of them since, but she knew them, and a lot of the time it's like, oh, what's that one? It's like, oh, I don't know. How are we going to figure it out? Okay, let's sneak up and see if we can get to it, and then it's like a kid sneaking game. So fun for them. So like, these are some of the things, especially with young kids, that are really great tools, really fun learning opportunities for the parent. I mean, mostly it's fun learning opportunities for the parents if you're into this type of thing. I am, so I think it's really fun. And it's great role modeling. I would say the last thing, and this is really key if, sort of relating back to like, if you want something for them, do it for yourself. Find a sit spot. Like find one place that you go to, you go there often, you slow down, you don't bring your phone. Even if you really want to ID things with your ID app, just don't bring your phone. Just go and pay attention with your senses in all seasons, at all different times of day, and just go there regularly and build a relationship with that space. And eventually, especially with the little kids, they might want to come with you. This is something that I've been doing with my daughter. It's kind of like these little mini sit spots, or like going and listening for the birds with her. And she holds these huge binoculars like backwards to her face, so she can't see anything, because it's like binoculars. When you hold them the wrong way around, you can't see anything because it's miles away. Anyways, it's very cute. But just the practice of like slowing down, going to one spot, doing that for yourself, and just developing like lots of mysteries and lots of questions that eventually you have a choice to like either follow through on or not. But that's just one of the most powerful nature connection tools. And I can't encourage it enough. So just to recap, tools: find a mentor, community practice, be curious, ask lots of questions with kids, in front of kids, for yourself. Role model, do the thing for yourself and do the thing in front of the kids that you want for them. Engage with the senses often and in all different ways. Really empower your senses, especially the non-dominant ones. So like not your eyes. Use all the other ones, lots and lots and lots. And slow down, find a sit spot. So there's actually only 5, but I somehow ended up with 6. So there's some useful tools for you.
Amazing. Thanks so much for all that, Andrew. One thing I just wanted to share, because I know there's probably some teachers in the crowd tonight, and one challenge I've had with the sit spot idea is like, pushback from either parents or administration being like, hey, I sent my kids here to learn something today, and you're just going to go and take them out to go sit in the woods or send them off to the space. What is the value in that? And I think about how, one of the things we named at the beginning of this was this mental health epidemic that people have right now. And something that I've come across recently, I also do some corporate training. So I did a corporate training recently with a medical team, actually the executive team for a hospital, who were just stressed to the max from their experience with COVID. And we took them out and we did sit spots. It was so profound and powerful. And these adults were like, I haven't done this in years, just gone out and sat in nature. Like, I can't believe how good I feel right now. And how stressed. I didn't know how wound up I was until I went and sat out there quietly. Some of them actually really struggled to not look at their phone. We only sat for 15 minutes, and like half of them came back just like totally zenned out, like in heaven. And like the other half actually came back a little bit like, that was really hard for me to sit there. And they were actually like, why was that hard? That shouldn't be hard to sit there for 10 minutes. And where I'm going with this is, if we think about the both the anxiety epidemic, but also the challenges that we're facing around just the world changing so quickly, the ability to sit quietly by yourself in nature and reflect, I think is, as potent a skill for your work, for your family life, for your mental health as anything else we're going to teach kids. And really, a lot of people can't do that anymore. To be able to sit quietly in nature it's for 100,000 years of human history. This was an essential part of our tool set for adaptability and for resilience. So helping people redevelop that, I don't think we can give people a better gift. And as simple as it sounds, it's profound. Like, I've had people come back from these and they're crying, adults, because they just forgot that was a thing that humans did. And it actually feels really good. And actually, sometimes the answers to your really challenging problems, when you quiet your mind in nature, just come to you. So,
yeah, I mean, I'm guilty. Like, I run this organization, and also like, hey, running a small nonprofit is like, talk about being torn in a million different directions all the time and attached to screens and computers and blah, blah, blah. So like, here's my message. And also, wow, I struggle with it sometimes, and just going out and sitting. I mean, I'm thankful that I hunt regularly, and the first few times out sitting quietly is like very difficult for me, and just reminds me like, oh yeah, this is important, because it gets easy and it feels so much better. But wow, the addiction is real.
The other one I just wanted to throw out, I was thinking about the teenager question again, and I can't recommend enough, and maybe it's not for every kid. I don't at all prescribe to there being one way to parent or one way to raise. I recognize the diversity in kids' needs and their vision and purpose in life. But I can't recommend getting kids on backcountry canoe trips enough. Whether it's with an organization like the Pine Project or, something like Outward Bound. And I know sometimes there can be access issues financially for things like that, but there are a lot of organizations that do have bursary programs to take kids into the outdoors. But, an extended canoe trip in the backcountry, for life skill development and core competency development, I can't recommend that enough. So I just wanted to plant that seed as well.
I mean, funny you should mention it, Chris. We happen to have a number of spots with bursaries for what we call our Voyageurs trip this summer, which is a 2-week backcountry trip in Temagami.
We didn't actually plan that segue right there.
Nope, didn't plan that one. We got some other ones coming up. We did plan, but not that one.
Cool. Awesome. Well, that is the segue, though, to close us up, though, Andrew. I would love you just to share with the group about, what Pine Project has going on. And if people want to learn more or get involved, how can they connect with you guys? What do you guys have coming up?
Yeah, I mean, I think the best thing to do, if you're interested in this talk, if you're interested in nature connection for yourself or for your kids, if you live around Toronto or within a couple hours drive, our adult program called Wild Deer is really wonderful. Chris is one of the guest instructors at times. And as he said, it's a transformational experience, just going on a personal nature connection journey. It's like a 6-weekend across 6-month journey, which is quite in depth. A lot of very different experiences and a lot of tools to be able to continue the nature connection journey, in your home and neighborhood and wherever you are. But yeah, if you're around
up there, if anyone wants to check out the Pine Project's website and some of the youth or adult programs they have going on there.
Yeah. And yeah, if you're around Toronto and you've got kids and you're looking for this type of thing, so our summer camps sell out in an instant. But just get involved wherever. Reach out, look for what's happening. We run programs basically at all times of the year for all different, like on the weekend, after school, during the day, like instead of school. Like a lot of kids find that they're much better in school when they spend half a day out in the woods a week with us. And we run summer camps, we run March break camps, like we kind of do everything. So if you're around Toronto, check us out. If you're not, just look up Nature Connection. Nature Connection as like a hashtag or a key phrase, and look for organizations that are similar or running Nature Connection programs. There's quite a few of them out there. There's a great one in Guelph called the Guelph Outdoor School. There's some in like Montreal, program Coyote, something like that.
Tons down in the States too. I know we have a lot of
down in the States
tonight.
In Vancouver, there's a great one. So just check out, see what organizations are out there. And I would really encourage trying to like get your kids involved. I know from 15 years of watching kids be involved that there's pretty potent potential in terms of how different a kid can look as an 8-year-old that's been in these programs for 4 years beside an 8-year-old that's just starting for the first time. It's kind of dramatic and a little bit scary, but really speaks to the power of just nature and caring mentors and people asking good questions and challenging each other. I think that's most of it. Follow us on social. Our social media streams are we're not posting a ton of content all the time, but like we do post some content from time to time that's pretty interesting, or might have cool recipe or like an interesting story from programs or something that just has some learning content for adults. So follow along, and at the very least, you'll just kind of be introduced to, I think, Nature Connection as a theme, and probably some of the wider network. I think that's how the algorithms work. Anyways, I think that's about it. Thanks so much for coming and listening to Chris and I banter back and forth, and all the best.
Yeah, awesome, Andrew. Thanks so much for being with us tonight, man. I feel like there was a bunch of gems in there. It was spot on with our theme for the evening. I just want to remind folks, next week is going to be a really special call. It's the last one in the series, and we're going to have my wife, Laura, on, who's actually a professional wild forager. And she's going to be talking about foraging food and mushrooms from the forest, as well as modern day homesteading. So growing food, even if you live in urban spaces. And we have Caleb Musgrave on from Canadian Bushcraft, who is just an absolute wealth of knowledge around homesteading and all things kind of bush skills, self-reliance, and the land. So tune in next week, our very last session. Thanks for a great night, everybody. Thank you so much, Andrew, for sharing some time with us tonight. We really appreciate it. What was the name of the team trip again? That's
Voyageurs.
The Voyageurs. Okay, cool.
Yeah. Part of our Red Wolf overnight camp.
Awesome. Night, everybody. Thanks for joining.